Well, the times were changing, and I was completely out of vinyl by this point. Nowhere to get it. So CDs were becoming the big thing. A lot of great new albums came out in 1991, all of which I have on CD. One of which I have on vinyl, but I'm not going to show vinyl. I have a Magic Box for that. It was a changing time, changing places, changing sounds. The music was completely changing by the end of the year, with one genre knocking off another. And there's a lot in between, too. And I'm going to tell you about it. The year was 1991. I'm TC Kirkham. This is Not Just Vinyl Recall. Hey all, TC Kirkham here, the Kirkham Report and TKR Video Central. Welcome to Not Just Vinyl Recall. I'm going to go over my top favorite albums of 1991. This was hard. There are a lot of good albums that came out in 1991. But it's me, so you're going to get a lot of surprises, a lot of weird stuff, and, you know, just how it always is when you're dealing with a pop fan like me that likes a little bit of everything. All the albums are going to be shown via Magic Box because, of course, we are doing CDs now. And let's kick things off with my number 10 favorite album of 1991. I mentioned this lady on the 1990 show, and I said the 1991 album was almost as good. It was. Not as high as last year's, but definitely in the top 10. 3 huge singles and a lot of great music. Number 10 for 1991, Emotions from Mariah Carey. Mariah was the star of 1990. She broke out big all over the world. And the second album, usually at that point in time, it was not unusual for acts to go 3, maybe even 4 years between albums. Columbia wanted her to do an album a year, going back to the old style where artists would release 3 or 4 albums in 1 year. This time, they said once a year because she's such a killer in the studio. She's always writing, always recording. Well, she went along with it for a while, and Emotions was the first product after her debut album. It was really, really fun, filled with great dance music, great ballads, a lot of stuff written with Walter Alfansanov, the holdover from her previous effort, plus new people she wrote with, included CNC Music Factory, Carole King, all kinds of great stuff. Released on September 13th, 1991, 3 big singles, Emotions, Can't Let Go, and Make It Happen. Emotions gave her her 5th #1 single in a row, making her the first female to ever do that from a debut, her first 5 singles in a row. She missed 6 in a row by 1 spot. Can't Let Go peaked at number 2 because right when it was starting to really take off, Columbia pulled the single and there wasn't enough to get it to number 1. That was at a time when singles were being pulled routinely in an effort to change the way music was being bought and heard. Emotions has some of her best work on it, besides her debut album. And as I said on the 1990 show, I did fall out of Mariah after a few years, but the first few albums are all terrific, and her second album is number 10 on my list for 1991. It is Emotions. Now, this was a hard one. I talked to people about this one, and I said, should I include them together? Should I make them separate? Because they're both iconic. I ultimately decided to do them separately, but am giving them the same number with a different designation. So instead of number 9, we're going to talk about 8B, 8A, and 8B. Because they are the same album with the same title and the same band, but they have mostly different songs on them. And those of you who think I'm not a metal fan might be surprised to see these two albums on my list. Number 8A and B, Use Your Illusion 1 and 2 by Guns N' Roses. I was a big Guns N' Roses fan. Kim got me into them more than I was when they first premiered. I wasn't really into anything but pop metal at that point. But Kim, ever the hard music fan, got me into harder and harder music. It got me listening to it. And, Use Your Illusion 1 and Use Your Illusion 2 were both released in September of 1991 on the same day. Use Your Illusion 2 hit number 1. Use Your Illusion 1 hit number 2. And it was the band's last album of original material until 2008's disastrous album Chinese Democracy. The less said about that, the better. Use Your Illusion 1 included, let me see if I got to get these in the right order. Use Your Illusion 1 included the single version of Don't Cry, also the single of Live and Let Die, and Guns N' Roses' signature song, November Rain. It also included Garden of Eden, which was a huge video hit on MTV, along with a lot of other great rock songs that everybody remembers. Kim is a big fan of both of these albums, and I became a big fan of them. But this one, November Rain, one of the best songs ever written. Their cover of Live and Let Die is top-notch, and Don't Cry, wonderful ballad that in and around Bad Obsession, Back Off Bitch, Right Next Door to Hell, The Garden, which has a guest appearance by Alice Cooper and a bunch of other good stuff on it. Use Your Illusion 2 had more hits from it. You Could Be Mine from Terminator 2 came from that movie, from that album. Also Knocking on Heaven's Door, Yesterday, and Estranged, both of which were singles but did not chart in a big way. They were popular on MTV. And the alternate version of Don't Cry, which was also in a separate video on MTV. Overall, the two Use Your Illusion albums present Guns N' Roses at its very best. They weren't this good before. They have never reached that peak since. And I know people are going to argue that a lot of the later stuff wasn't really Guns N' Roses because Axl was the only one there. Although Slash did reunite with him at one point. I think Izzy Stradlin also did. I'm not sure. But overall, these two albums are the best Guns N' Roses ever had to offer. In addition to the single, there was also Get in the Ring, Pretty Tied Up, Locomotive, My World. There have been, deluxe editions of the albums released over the years that also have interesting material that was not released before. But the two original albums are still the best, and it's hard to separate them. And Kim thought I should put them as separate albums. I'm like, how am I going to do that when I like both of them equally? So I've decided to include them as separate spots, but in the same number. Number 8A and number 8B, Use Your Illusion 1 and 2 from Guns N' Roses. Sorry if there was a sound problem before that. I just realized I didn't move my mic over where I should have. So excuse me for that, and also for I've got a frog in my throat here for some reason. Get a drink. Number 7 is an album that I ended up loving. I bought because I had to. The song I heard performed off the album when the lady was on The Tonight Show, I absolutely love, but I couldn't find the single for anything. There was no cassette single that I could find, no CD single, and then I said, I gotta have this song. I'm just gonna buy the album. Well, the album turned out to be, I don't have very much of her stuff, but this is the best album I have by her. I wish it had been a bigger hit in the US. It was much bigger in the UK. But by this time, she had stopped having major hits on the Hot 100. She was still hitting the crossover charts on the R&B and the AC chart every now and then. This album had some terrific music on it, and it does include that single that I was looking for, which is my favorite song by her of all time. Number 7 for 1991, The Force Behind the Power by Diana Ross. This album was her 19th solo album, released in September of 1991. The biggest hit off of it in the States was When You Tell Me You Love Me. That's just the song that I adore by her, and it is still my favorite song by her of all time. It hit number 2 in the UK. It only hit number 26 on the AC chart here in America, and I think it cracked the Hot 100, though it was in the lower reaches, like 70 or below. Which, really, there was no excuse for that. This album was stupendous. That was the third single from the album, and the first single had actually come out way back in 1988, If We Hold On Together. Then there was No Matter What You Do, a duet with Al B. Sure, released in February, and following When You Tell Me You Love Me, That You Love Me, You're Gonna Love It, and The Force Behind the Power were both released as singles, commercially available singles, and several other radio singles were issued. The title track is awesome, but When You Tell Me You Love Me, written by John Bettis and Albert Hammond, Diana's best performance in history. And I love all of her ballads. Touch Me in the Morning, Do You Know Where I'm Going To, Theme from Mahogany. And I like some of her up-tempo stuff too, like Upside Down, I'm Coming Out, stuff like that. She is never better than she was on this song and on the title track from the album. And also Heart Don't Change My Mind, her duet, which was later released as a single. And I think it hit the AC chart also. Terrific stuff all the way around. Diana was at rare form here, and Americans were already beeping, oh, you're old news, we're going to pass you. That's so unfair. Because while Diana's peak was in the 1970s, and particularly, maybe even more so in the early 80s from 1980 to 1983, during her last years in Motown and her first years on RCA. Motown was big, but she wasn't a consistent hit maker. And as a solo artist on the pop chart, she was on the R&B chart, and on the AC chart, she also did well. And this album deserved better than it got. Number 7, The Force Behind the Power by Diana Ross. Number 6, I gravitated to this band because I have been in love with the lead singer's voice since his self-titled band in the mid-'80s when I first heard him. A couple of solo albums in between, a lot more solo material after the band, and they're still around. They just had a new album come out the other day, and I wasn't aware of it until it was too late, so I haven't picked it up yet, but I will. But 1991 brought their breakthrough album, their biggest hit album, and my favorite album. It's their number 6 album of 1991, Lean Into It by Mr. Big. Mr. Big features the incredible Eric Martin on lead vocals. I have been a fan of Eric Martin's since his self-titled band, the Eric Martin Band, Sucker for a Pretty Face, back in 1984. I have a solo album from the mid-'80s. I have all the Mr. Big stuff. I have most of his solo stuff after Mr. Big, and the later releases that came out for Record Store Day also of Little Big, of Mr. Big. Eric Martin is just one of the best vocalists ever. His 2008 album Timeless, which is all covers of stuff mostly from the 70s through the 90s. I have listened to that album so much, it's scary. His cover of Superstar, the Leon Russell song, is almost better than the Carpenters. Not quite, almost. Of course, Lean Into It was their big breakthrough album, but it took 3 singles. The first 2 singles kind of bombed. There was Daddy, Brother, Lover, Little Boy, the Electric Drill song, and then Green Tinted 60s Mine. Then the third single and the fourth single were monster hits. To Be With You hit number 1, Just Take My Heart hit the top 10, and turned them into a bankable act. The first album was great. The third album was great, but they weren't nearly as big. The first album, Mr. Big, came out in 1989, and the third album, Bump Ahead, in 1993. The third album has a great cover of Wild World, Cat Stevens' classic song. But you don't get better than what you got with this album. Every song is fun, whether it's a ballad or an up-tempo number or a mid-tempo number. Eric, Billy Sheehan, Paul Gilbert, Pat Torpey, they make this work all the way around. It is just my favorite album by them, and it's number 6 on my list of my favorite albums of 1991. Mr. Big's Lean Into It. Number 5 was the first of 2 self-titled albums by this gentleman. I have to admit, I didn't like the second one from 1994 as well as I liked this one. Again, I bought this because I could not find the single. I found the CD single later and ended up picking it up because it had like 6 different mixes on it, all of which were great. But I always found his songwriting to be stupendous and his vocals to be top-notch. He was very much a socially aware artist, writing songs about stuff besides romance. There was some real hard-hitting stuff in what he would write here and in the 1994 album. I'm surprised he never became the overwhelmingly huge hit he could have been here in the States. He did overseas. But this album was top-notch from beginning to end. The self-titled debut album by Seal is my number 5 album for 1991. In addition to Crazy, which became his only major hit here until 1994, it also featured the singles Future Love Paradise, The Beginning, Killer, and Violet, along with several other really great album tracks. This was one of those albums I owned when I was working a third shift at a convenience store and had it with me. Had my CD player with me every night and was playing albums every night. This always got in the rotation. It was really fantastic. I love the music. Crazy especially. And then again, Kiss from a Rose from the second self-titled album from 1994 are his best known songs in the States. But he's done much better in his native England and continues to do all kinds of stuff all over in all different genres. He's pushed jazz and R&B and pop to new levels. He is just really fantastic. And this album was the beginning. Number 5 for 1991, Seal by Seal. Number 4 is going to surprise people, not because of who it is, but because of which album it is. His first 2 albums did not make my list of the top 10, but that was also because I wasn't including CDs yet. Had I been including CDs, both of them would have made my top 10. This one does, and it is absolutely from beginning to end great across the board, and it contains some of my favorite hits by him also. Number 4, my favorite album from 1991, Rush Street by Richard Marx. This is the album that includes Keep Coming Back, Take This Heart, and Hazard. It also includes great album tracks like Playing with Fire, Hands in Your Pocket, Calling You, Streets of Pain, Chains Around My Heart. These are all great songs. Richard was the romantic songwriter guy in the late 80s and early 90s. He could rock with the best of them. He could do power ballads with the best of them. And this album produced Hazard, which is one of the most enigmatic singles ever, because they made several different endings for the video. The song tells the story of a kid from the wrong side of the tracks who fell in love with a girl who was later murdered, and he says he didn't kill her. The sheriff says he did. The video implies that the sheriff killed her and is pinning it on him. The video was terrific. Richard's godfather Robert Conrad played the sheriff in that. I'm still not sure how that happened. But in any case, Hazard is one of the most enigmatic songs of all time, and it led to other songs similar to that along that nature, most notably Hanson's Yearbook in 1997, where a similar song that doesn't give you an ending, and Marx has never declared an ending, which is infuriating to some people. I don't think it's necessary. You can make your own conclusions. There's fan fiction out there about what happened after Hazard. It's pretty crazy. The album was produced by Richard and his friend Fee Waybill of the Tubes. They make a great combination. They co-wrote a number of the songs on the album, including Chains Around My Heart, which is one of my favorite songs by him. And it was the fourth single also. This deserves better than it gets because people think of the first two albums, the self-titled debut and Repeat Offender, because they both had monster #1 hits or close to #1 hits on it. And Satisfied, Hold On to the Nights, Right Here Waiting, all of those. Keep Coming Back, which features background vocals from Luther Vandross, is a marvelous song. Spent 3 weeks at #1 on the Kirkham Report chart. Hazard did as well. And is my favorite album by him. I love the first two and I love the later ones. Rush Street is my favorite album by him. If you've not heard the whole album, you should. And you should probably also make up your own ending to Hazard. Number 4 for 1991 on my favorites list, Rush Street by Richard Marx. Number 3 is going to be a bit of a curve because I didn't really hear this music until the summer of 1992, a year later. One of the songs from the album was featured in one of my all-time favorite movies. And, yes, I will admit to it. I was going through a really rough part of my life in the spring of 1992. Things were happening that between my general life, my work life, that had sent me spiraling into almost at the level of true depression. And the only thing that was able to pull me out of that was a ridiculously silly 1992 movie, which marked the film debut of Brendan Fraser in a big way. He actually filmed something else first, but it was the first major release. And made me a fan of Sean Astin, who I'd never cared for before, and Pauly Shore, also who I'd never cared for before. The movie was Encino Man. I saw it 8 times in 10 days at the theater because I just couldn't stop laughing. It's so ridiculous. I've seen it on, I have the DVD, I've watched it hundreds of times. I still like it. I suppose it would be considered a guilty pleasure. The soundtrack to Encino Man is one of the best ever, and I found a lot of acts on it. One of the acts I found was the band whose album actually came out the year before. When I was up here visiting my wife in 1992, before I moved up here, I found the album at the local Strawberries, and I bought it. It was a cassette. They didn't have the CD. And fell in love with the whole album. Which is kind of odd because it is, while parts of it are in English, it is mostly in indigenous language from Australia. At the time it was called Aboriginal. I don't know that they still use that term anymore. The song that grabbed me was Treaty. It's seen in Encino Man when Link first breaks into Dave's house and it's playing on MTV. It was a #1 hit in 1992 on my Kirkham Report chart, and I would go back and buy the album and just fall in love with the album. 1991's #3, Tribal Voice by Yothu Yindi. This album, filled with great music, both traditional and pop music, with a band that is made up entirely of indigenous musicians. It is fantastic. AllMusic reviewer Jonathan Lewis commented on it that The song and the music is sometimes insipid, but despite this, Tribal Voice is a fine example of both traditional and modern Aboriginal music. And it is. I love the use of traditional language. I love the use of traditional instruments, and they're all put to a great dance beat, especially on Treaty, which was a big dance hit on the disco chart. Um, a really great album. If you're into world music, I would give it a check because it is really fantastic. Number 3 on my list of favorite albums from 1991, Tribal Voice by Yothu Yindi. Number 2 was an album, let me get a drink here. Number 2 was an album that marked a seminal change in music in 1991. It had been percolating for 2 or 3 years before that. But by the end of the year, this album had been released. The genre had taken off. It pushed hair metal completely off the radio in most cases. And you just have to wonder if it would have done as well if the album that really launched it hadn't been so good. Even me, Mr. Pop Guy, bought the cassette single of the single when it was out because it was just so damn catchy. My friend Chris, we had gone up to a mall in Newark, Ohio at the time. My friend Chris was like, "What are you buying that shit for?" Because he was into Garth Brooks and stuff. I'm like, "What are you listening to that shit for?" Of course, he later became a fan of these guys, and I later became of Garth Brooks. But I loved that first single. And from that, I would watch the rest of the stuff on MTV. I would eventually pick up the CD, although not until the 2000s. And I did get a vinyl copy when it was reissued for the 30th anniversary. It is the birth album of grunge. And grunge all but destroyed hair metal by the end of 1992. And this album was the first to really explode in that genre. Nevermind by Nirvana, number 2. There are some people that got angry that Rolling Stone named Kurt Cobain the artist of the century in 1999. I knew a guy when I worked at Disc Jockey who just thought that was heresy. Oh, he's a no good crap. He couldn't handle life, killed himself, blah, blah, blah. Kurt Cobain was an incredibly talented musician and an equally talented songwriter. It was couched with a lot of pain in his life, and I really didn't recognize the true genius of Cobain's music until the MTV Unplugged album came out. That's when I became a really rabid fan of the band. Up to that point, all I had was the single of Smells Like Teen Spirit. After that, I picked up Nevermind on CD, like I said, somewhere around 2000. And I've listened to everything else. My friends have all the other albums. He really was a musical genius in so many ways. And it is such a sad state that we lost him at such a young age, 27 years old. He was the voice of his generation. A lot of people called him that. He was the father of emergent grunge, a role that was shared by Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam, Lane Staley of Alice in Chains, and Scott Weiland of Stone Temple Pilots, only one of whom is still with us. Grunge has never been my favorite kind of music. I am not a Pearl Jam fan. Kim will tell you that. I do not like them at all. I like some Alice in Chains. I like some Nirvana. I like some of the other acts that emerged from the Seattle grunge scene. But there was something big and special about Nevermind. And I came to realize that when I listened to it, when I heard it in full for the first time, probably shortly before Kurt's death, because we had a girl that was obsessed with them at when I worked for Transworld, and she would play the album in store in the evening when we would let her do it. Kurt Cobain was a tragic figure. He will always be such because of his early death, as his unfortunate suicide. And I wish people around him had kept him going, because he had a lot more left to give. There was a lot more inside of him that had yet to come out. And like another favorite artist of mine who died young, Elliott Smith, we barely scratched the surface of Kurt Cobain. And I really think that's a tragedy. And his best work, and his best known work, is that number 2 favorite album of 1991, Nevermind from Nirvana. Okay, so let's go to number 1. And boy, it is a complete 180 from the last one. I knew from the second the single hit radio that these guys were going to be superstars. I could hear the harmonies. I could hear the beat style. I could hear everything about them and how good they were. And they were being produced by people associated with New Edition, Belle Biv DeVoe, Ralph Tresvant, Bobby Brown. They were deeply involved with that. Technically produced by Dallas Austin and the Characters, they emerged from high school in Philadelphia to become one of the biggest acts of the 90s. They are still together, although there are only 3 of them now. And they are still making incredible music. And their debut album is going to be one of my favorite albums of all time for the rest of my life. Number 1 favorite album of 1991, Cooley High Harmony by Boyz II Men. This album brought us Motown Philly, It's So Hard to Say Goodbye to Yesterday, and Please Don't Go as singles. End of the Road would later be included on this album in later pressings after appearing in Boomerang, I think it was. What a freaking debut this was. There wasn't a bad song on the entire album. They could do hip-hop, they could do R&B, they could do ballads, they could do a cappella, and they did it all well. They did it all stupendously well. And they were fantastic. Nathan Morris, Wanya Morris, Sean Stockman, let me grab it real quick here. And Michael McCrary, and who was left the band due to health reasons, and in the late 90s. They were all terrific. They all shared leads. They were all excellent singers. You had that level of harmony from upper tenor to mid baritone that was just amazing. And they produced some of the biggest hits of the early 90s. End of the Road, On Bended Knee, and their duet with Mariah Carey, One Sweet Day, spent something like a total collective of more than 6 months at number 1, if you added them all together. All of them had, like, in the teens weeks at number 1. End of the Road was 14 weeks. It wasn't surpassed until, I think, Macarena tied it, and it wasn't surpassed until Despacito, which was then surpassed by Old Town Road, at the number of weeks at number 1. It was a great song all the way around, and like I said, was included in later impressings of this. If you don't know these guys at all. And I can't imagine. I mean, the vinyl community is made up of a lot of diverse people. You got heavy metal people, you got hardcore jazz people, you got hardcore hip hop people, R&B people. Everybody in their everybody has room in their life for Boys to Men. If you've never heard this group, A, you've been living under a rock for 30 years plus. 2, you have a 10 ear when it comes to R&B. And 3, there's no hope for you. This album is just so stupendously good that I have to admit it was real close between this one and Nevermind, because I like it really a lot too. And those are completely diverse albums. They came out 6 months apart, completely different styles, and yet I love them almost equally for their contents, for what they represent for that genre. Overall, I picked Cooley High Harmony because it is just, quite honestly, a perfect album from beginning to end. My number one favorite album of 1991, Cooley High Harmony by Boyz II Men. Recapping, that's the wrong list. Give me the right list here. My number 10 was Emotions, Mariah Carey. Number 8, A and B, Use Your Illusion 1 and 2, Guns N' Roses. Number 7, The Force Behind the Power, Diana Ross. Number 6, Lean Into It, Mr. Big. Number 5, Seal by Seal. Number 4, Rush Street, Richard Marx. Number 3, Tribal Voice by Yothu Yendi. Number 2, Nevermind by Nirvana. And number 1, Cooley High Harmony by Boyz II Men. We got lots more to go through. I had a lot of the 90s, all the 2000s to go through. I got lots of research to do. But now that I can use CDs as well as vinyl, I feel easier and more at ease talking about these things, because I am a music fan, and the vinyl community and the CD community all together make up the music community. And so I hope you don't hate me for not including vinyl. I don't have a lot of vinyl from this period, unless they're reissues. I do have a Nevermind reissue. But I'm trying to show my best of what I have to offer. And I hope that you will, if you've not checked them all out, I hope you'll check the ones you think sound interesting out if you don't know them. And if you do know them, then you already know how great they are, right? We'll be back in a week with more great songs, this time from 1992, and I got a lot I need to talk about that year. For not just Vinyl Recall, I'm TC Kirkham, TKR Video Central and the Kirkham Report. I'll see you around the interwebs. Ciao, baby.